Hello and welcome to the next installment, the next lesson, the next episode of Cylinder Radio. Very excited for my episode today and my guest. My guest is the 2018 National Teacher of the Year from Ferris High School at the Newcomer Center in Spokane, not Spokane, I got that wrong, Spokane, Washington. Mandy Manning, thank you so much for coming on to Cylinder Radio.
Thanks for having me.
So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, I have teachers who listen to the podcast, and Teacher of the Year, that's a quite an honor. So how does that process, like, how does that happen where, the United States government, the president, says, hey, you're the Teacher of the Year? How does that all go down?
Well, the president does award the Teacher of the Year, but does not select the teacher.
Right. I assume, yeah.
I think that's probably an important point to make.
Mm-hmm.
It starts in the state, and every state selects their Teacher of the Year in a different way. So my state, we have 9 regions. We have a potential 10th region, but we don't often have nominees from that 10th region. The 10th region is the Bureau of Indian Education. So it's our educators who are Native and working with Native American students. So we sometimes have 10 and sometimes have 9 Teachers of the Year within our state. And so for my region, you are nominated and you write essays, and sometimes they'll interview or visit your classroom. And then of those people within that region who are nominated and complete the application process, because it's quite an extensive application process with letters of recommendation and several essays, then they choose the one. And so I was chosen for my region in mid-2017. And then the 9 or 10 regional Teachers of the Year come together. There's a whole process with interviews, essays, speech, things like that. And then they choose the State Teacher of the Year. And then that State Teacher of the Year becomes part of the cohort of all the State Teachers of the Year. So there's potential, I think, of 57 or 58 Teachers of the Year, because it's not only the, United States proper, it's also territories.
Right.
And so this year for 2019, they had 57. My year, they had 55 State Teachers of the Year. And of those 55, 4 finalists are selected. I was a finalist. And then those 4 finalists go for another rigorous interview speech-making process that then the one National Teacher of the Year is selected. And the selection committee for the state is a bunch of several different organizations who, like the Principals Association and the Vice Principals Association and former Educators of the Year, and all of these different advocacy groups come together to choose. And then for the national, it's through the Council of Chief State School Officers, and they bring together different advocacy organizations and education organizations, much the same, but on the national level. And so I believe there were 13 organizations in my year that selected the National Teacher of the Year.
What a process. And that's people from public schools, private schools, independent schools, charters, the whole thing?
Yeah, you have like National Board for Professional Teaching Standards was on there, National Education Association, the National PTA, so Parent Teacher Association, the different levels of principals, Middle School Principals Association, principals, secondary, there was a wide range of folks who, I think even the Urban Education League, maybe. So just different groups.
Well, that's a long process, and that's a lot of people involved. And that gets us to the cylinder essentially for today of the school system. And it seems like you'd be the perfect person to talk to about the school system, because you see it. You see it from not just being a teacher. There's a lot of teachers, but you've gone through this process where there's a lot of all of these different, rungs and all these different like layers of the onion of the process is all part of this system. These are all people that have a say in policy and all that kind of stuff. So you and I talked on the phone a little bit, maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we were kind of I think in a positive way, but a little bit like commiserating about some of the problems in the school system. And we saw a lot of the same things, even though maybe the environments that we teach in are different. So the school system in general, and that's a pretty vague thing, but would you agree that it is failing in some important ways, and these are perhaps problems that could and should be focused on to be fixed?
Well, I hesitate to use the word failing, because I think that we
Okay.
tripped up when we say things like schools are failing, because it prevents us from really getting to the root of what the actual problems are.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you really think about our education system, it's operating just as it was intended to operate. And I think that what you said earlier about that there are so many hands in the pot, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
There are, so many different organizations and so many layers to the onion, so to speak, that I think that when we're talking about real systemic change, that's the problem, because it is such a cumbersome, huge system that creating systemic change is difficult, because there are a lot of gatekeepers, and there are a lot of folks who are like, well, I don't want to lose my position. I want to make sure that we're, still operating the way that we are intended to operate. So when I say that it is operating exactly as it should, is that it is very much still a 19th century school model, as it was created a really long time ago for a single demographic of student. And because it still operates that way, that's where this idea that schools are failing it comes into play, because we're not addressing the changing demographics of our nation, or recognizing I really think that it's not really changing the demographics, it's that we're recognizing the reality of the diversity of our of the United States. And so when you're operating within a system that was intended only to serve a single type of student, of course it's not going to work the way we need it to. But it is working. It's working for who it's intended to work for.
So do you see it as the changing demographics, or do you see it as, because I guess I suppose I see it as more, I think that's part of it. I also think that part of it is the technological advances. Is, you look at you go into a classroom and it doesn't look a whole lot different than it did 50 years or even longer, maybe 100 years ago. Desks lined up, teacher in the front. I mean, maybe it's a whiteboard instead of a blackboard now. And, there's different, I'm using generalizations here because there are amazing teachers in probably every school in America that are doing things very differently.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But, when 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you would only watch TV based on what was on TV, and you didn't have as many options and choices. I said something on my Instagram recently about how, if you would have told someone even just 10 years ago, not only could you make a living playing video games, but you can make a living watching people play video games and comment on it. Like, this is so crazy. The world is just advancing so fast. And then you go into a classroom and they're like, sit down and we're going to read Great Gatsby or Moby Dick or something like that. And I think that those books are still applicable 100%. I just think that there's a disconnect there a lot in school between what kids get outside of school and they go into school. It feels very antiquated.
Yeah, well, that's because of our system. So we have this very rigid 19th century system. So what we have done over the years is that instead of thinking about how technology changes what we do, we think about how technology fits into our rigid box. That's why you see, one-to-one classrooms where everybody has a Chromebook or everybody has an iPad or whatever, but they're still using it for like the same things we would do if we went into the library and used encyclopedias.
Right.
And typewriters. So or writing longhand, right? So we're not thinking about how technology could revolutionize education. We're thinking about, okay, well, we have all this technology we need to use. How can we do the same old thing, but now use fancy technology, because that's what's going to engage kids. But that's like missing the point, because that's not going to engage kids when you're using it in such an old-fashioned way. But I do, though, believe that it is a demographic problem too, because what we're faced with right now is we've gone through century, you know, like what, a century. You could edit that out.
I'm sure you know the difference.
We've gone for the past, 100 some years operating in the system that was intended for one demographic, because that was the demographic that was viewed by our, leaders as the one that mattered. And I think now we're seeing that, which we should have always, but now we're seeing people recognize that we're all valuable, regardless of the color of our skin or the where we come from or the language we initially spoke or what, our ethnicity, that we all have value and we all deserve that opportunity to become productive, happy community members. And so technology is a piece of that. But I think if we don't address that initial thing, it doesn't matter how much technology, because if you think about, we have areas in our communities where there is no Wi-Fi. We have communities where kids have phones, but they don't have data plans. My dog just came in. Hello? I don't know what that was. That was weird.
Okay. Oh, no problem.
My dog is in here now. So until we address the issues of race and white supremacy and poverty, we're not going to be, it doesn't matter what we do, because you're going to have kids who have phones but don't have data plans. So what are they using those phones for? They're using them to take pictures. And maybe if they have a Wi-Fi connection, then they can get on their Snapchat or whatever. But there's so much inequity that it doesn't matter how much fancy stuff we put into our schools, because if kids can't access it outside of the school building, it's not going to help them.
Yeah. So just curious, when you say like that we address white supremacy and things like that, is this a white issue or is it a class issue? Because there's a lot of obviously very poor white neighborhoods all throughout the country where the same kind of situations.
It's both, but you have to, if you talk about that without color of skin, then you're missing an entire part of the conversation, because without skin color. Because if you think about, yes, we have so many kids living in poverty, white, black, Hispanic, any kind of kid you could, describe visually, we're gonna have a portion of those children living in poverty. Now we can get into the nuances of the data of that and show that there are significantly more of certain racial groups that are living in poverty. But the thing is that the one factor that does not impact a white person who lives in poverty is the color of their skin. So if you look at data across time, so like what is that, longitudinal data, then you can see that if you are poor and white, there is potential for you to move out of being in poverty. It's harder and harder. I will say that it's harder and harder and harder and harder for anyone living in poverty to get out of poverty. But it's nearly impossible, if not impossible, for our communities of color, if they're born into poverty, to get out of poverty. And that solely has to do with the color of their skin. And so we have to recognize this and then work to overcome that. It's not about feeling a bunch of guilt. It's not about being, defensive and saying, well, I'm white and I'm not a white supremacist. It's about recognizing that exists and that we have systems in place that support that, and that we have to actively work to ensure that we are not participating or complicit in that. And that we are trying to change.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Can you give an example? Because I might have listeners that are curious, like what is an example of a policy that is, a white supremacist policy, or a policy that is disproportionately, anti, black or anti-Latino or whatever it might be? Like what would be an example of that? So we have something concrete to be like, this is something that is bad for this faction of America?
Well, there you could look at the disproportionate impact of discipline policies.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, the school to prison pipeline is a very real thing. You have kids who are, and this disproportionately impacts our kids who are brown or black. So you have kids at the kindergarten level who are being suspended from school. And then if you look at how we've traditionally dealt with discipline, that then follows them. So then each year something new compounds on their record until they get to high school. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't matter what they do. They could leave their hat on their table. The teacher could get mad. They could get sent to the office. And then all of a sudden they're suspended or expelled because it escalated, right? So there's one way, and you can look at the data within your own community and see how discipline disproportionately impacts communities of color. And you could also look at gifted and talented programs and special education. You can see that there's over-identification of kids of color in special education programs. And that is the case across the board. You can also look at they are less represented in our gifted and talented programs. You could look at English language learners alone, because if you look at my students who are coming in at 14, 15, 16 years old, brand new to our nation, no English, because those are the requirements to be in my class. They have to have been in the nation for 3 months or fewer and have little to no English language proficiency. And so those kids, if you look at them just in general, they come in and they often graduate in 4 years, which is, if that's not evidence of giftedness, I don't know what is, because it takes 5 to 7 years for native-like fluency. Plus, most of them are multilingual. So they come in knowing more than one language just right off the bat. And yet, they are often over-identified for special service, like special education, and under-identified for any kind of honors opportunities. And that's really about our inability to, or maybe our lack of confidence in being able to meet the needs of the communities that we are not a mirror of. So I work with English language learners, but I'm a white woman who has never experienced being displaced from my home. And I am limited in my language ability. I speak other languages, but not by any means fluently. And so I have little in common. And so many teachers would be like, well, we don't speak the same language, so I'm not going to be able to meet their needs, which is just not true. We just have to stretch ourselves and challenge ourselves and recognize, okay, we have differences, but I'm going to be able to teach these amazing students anyway. And I think that happens through so many different things. We're socialized, and we don't even know that we're socialized. Plus, if you look at the teaching population, like 80%, between 80 and 80, I think it's 80% are white, and like 86% are women. So already we can see a disproportionality there, because majority of teachers in every classroom are white women. So if we're not doing that work of recognizing how we maybe will have assumptions or maybe we'll have perceptions, if we're not doing that work, then we're going to have reactions to kids without even knowing that we're being biased against them.
Yeah, I want to, because this is a little bit off like the trail a little bit, but I think it's important, is when we look at data of, maybe say Black kids are punished more regularly than white kids or things like that. Wouldn't you think that data would be very hard to compile in a very like rigorous way? Because every time a kid acts up, it's going to be different. There's a different situation as far as like the demographics, also about like single parent households in certain communities and things like that. Like there's a whole lot going on. Is it that these kids are acting up more, or is it that they are being punished more and they're acting up at the same rate? And if it's the first one, so it's a lot, but if they go back to the first one, if they're acting up more, is that because of the color of their skin and the systemic racism, or is it because of the failure of certain communities and family structures and things like that? also, I mean, it probably is a little bit of all of this, right? I mean, it's just so hard to quantify, to get accurate data, because if there is clear data that, you know, Sally and Maria are, you know, doing the same thing, and one of them is treated worse than the other, that is fundamentally, you know, wrong by every American standard. But if it's Maria or Sally is doing more bad things, then, well, then we should, you know, then of course she's going to be punished more. But then we have to look at, why is Sally doing more bad things? You know what I'm saying? I know it's a little like cloudy, but yeah.
This is often our instinct, is to blame the person who's doing the behavior. But there are definitely cases where two kids did the exact same behavior and they had very different consequences. And
couldn't that go the other way too? Aren't there examples where a white kid and a black kid, and the white kid gets punished more too? Like, that's anecdotally
very few. Like, you could do a survey of preschool parents, and you could then, I mean, this happened with my own child. So my child is, you know, very white. He has a white daddy and a white mommy, and he's got blue eyes and blonde curly hair, and he's, you know, by societal standards, he's like, you know, the guy, right? So he went to school he went to preschool in an extremely diverse environment. I purposely put him into a school where he would have access to a lot of different kids that were very different from him. And every day I could come in and he could do the same behavior as another kid, and no one would even bat an eye. But then another kid who is black would be like sitting in the corner every single day. And so, and you know that they're not doing things. I mean, my little boy is a little boy too, and he's doing things. And we could talk about how I parent and how other people parent. But at the end of the day, it's an inability to see, because we are so ingrained with this idea that this community is going to come into school with deficits, and this community is going to have everything they need and all the supports they need. We're doing a disservice to both of those communities, especially when we're starting to have conversations around, well, are they really acting up more? They're not acting up more. They might be reacting. They might be reacting to societal expectations of them. Because even look at movies. How are we portraying young black boys as opposed to young white boys? And you could look at the court system, and you could do a study of how many black kids are in juvenile detention and how many white kids are in juvenile detention. You could just look at, I mean, how many things have we had in the news around white college boys doing things like rape, and then being told, oh, well, you have a good family, you have a good future, so we're just going to give you probation. Like, I mean, there are so many examples out there. And I think our resistance to this, our desire to believe that it's not that we're having bias and we're reacting differently to our students of color. The reason that we feel that is because then we have to feel guilty and we have to feel bad. But we should not waste time on that. Don't waste time on feeling guilty. Think about, okay, what can I do to change my perceptions, or at least put them in check, so that I can be more open to the kids in my classroom and not maybe target some kids more than other kids. There was just an article that came out. I wish I could remember the title of the article, but it talked about a black student's experience at school, and how if you're in the hallway and there's a white group of kids in the hallway, they'll be like, there's the assumption that they're doing something related to school. So they're moving from one place to another place for a purpose that's related to school. But there's always an assumption that, I shouldn't use the word always, but there's often the assumption that the group of black students or brown students are doing something nefarious. And that is how they are responded to. So if you look in the hallway, there's some white kids, you'll be like, oh, where are you guys going? It's just a regular conversation. And then there's the black kids doing the exact same thing. And you're like, what are you doing out of class? Get to class. Why aren't you in class right now?
Yeah.
And
I don't doubt I'm sorry. I cut you off.
it's unconscious, and that's part of the problem. We have to become conscious of this in order to be able to address it.
Yeah, I mean, I taught in Philadelphia at a predominantly black school, and then I taught in LA I was 0% white. It was like 90% Hispanic, and I remember like I walked in. I'm from a fairly white area in Pennsylvania, and I walked in. It was like a lot of black kids, and I was like, whoa, it's a lot of black kids. And then within a week, I would have to rack my brain, and be like, oh yeah, right, that kid's black. Because I mean, you probably know this also. I think most teachers do that. Like, when you get to know the kids, then their skin color, you start to know their software more than their hardware. And and in a lot of these schools, schools are very segregated in America by race.
Yeah.
And when I taught in the school that was 0% white, I was able, maybe it's because it wasn't as heterogeneously mixed, but I was able to just identify this kid is more of a troublemaker, or for lack of a better term, and this kid is more of not. And it didn't have anything to do with like how dark skinned they were and things like that. I worry about, I think it's good to hear everyone's story, of course. I think everyone needs to be treated fairly in America, of course. Like, I worry about, is this true? Is the data concrete enough to say, like, yes, the school system acts in a way that is racist? And it might, but like, even like the police system's a similar thing. And Roland Fryer did his whole thing at Harvard about how he found, like, no, police departments don't disproportionately arrest or whatever black people. But is that, even when it comes against that narrative, is that good data? Like, how do we tell even if this is good social science that's supporting it? And maybe we're splitting hairs. And at the end of the day, we should just recognize that people have paths that are very different from our own, and we need to be aware if we do treat kids differently based on unconscious, subconscious biases or prejudices or things like that. But I don't know, I just when I wanted to do this podcast on the school system, I didn't think like of like the racial like component. But yeah, I mean, it's important to talk about.
Well, but I think that you have to have that conversation in order to get to the whole heart of what you and I talked about on the phone, which is like, what is school for? What is school for? Because we have set in place a lot of barriers for so many of our community members, like with the standardized testing, with accelerated academics, where we're expecting kids to now begin to read in preschool. When we put in these measures that we think, okay, we're going to then be able to prepare all of our community members, because I think that is what they're wanting to do. But in reality, when they put in all of these measures, they're then putting up more barriers. Because, and additionally, we look at things that are easy for us to, at a glance, determine if it's working or not working, without really thinking, well, is it really assessing what we're wanting to assess? It's so easy to look at a spreadsheet and look at numbers and be like, okay, this school is doing fine and this school is not doing fine. Instead of thinking about, okay, well, what is school for? School is for building the next generation of humans and ensuring that they are a productive community who knows how to learn, because that's what school is about. School is about learning to be a learner. And when we set up structures that begin, like we are beginning in preschool with a deficit mindset. So we're not looking at, okay, we're going to get this whole group of kids and we're going to figure out where they have strengths. And then we're going to build from there. We're thinking, okay, we already know we're going to have these deficits. We're going to have this community is going to come in and they're not going to know their alphabet and they're not going to know their numbers. And maybe we've got a bunch of kids who now aren't going to be potty trained and all of this stuff. We're thinking about how are we going to mitigate those deficits instead of, hey, you know what? We've got a wide variety of kids, and they're going to come to us with a lot of different talents and assets. So how are we going to take all those kids and we're going to get them from point A to point B? And instead of being like, you have to do it this way in lockstep, I mean, the things that they're doing in elementary schools right now with pacing guides and scripted curriculum really prevents teachers from being able to individually meet the needs of their students. Because how can you meet the needs of students when you're on a pacing guide and you have to be here on this day, on this page, saying this thing? It's impossible to differentiate under those circumstances. So we have to be able to be more flexible. Doesn't mean that we don't have standards. Doesn't mean that we don't have, we want all kids to be able to write a paper, read a book, whatever. But we need to be able to have flexibility in how we get there. Plus, we need to ensure that we're providing kids with autonomy and showing them that they have agency and that they are the ones who really control their learning. But that's not how we teach. We have a complete deficit model. And then we measure that deficit model with test scores that don't actually show us anything about the kids.
Yeah, when I taught in like really challenging areas, the principal who started the charter school I was at, told me that the neighborhood I was in made Watts look like Disneyland. I was like, oh my gosh. But what I found was the kids who were, had two parents in the household, were read to at an early age, were, had some sort of like structure, had a community, maybe they went to church or something like that. They had a church community or something like that. They were the ones who excelled because maybe like what you're saying, like they were the ones who were able to fit into this system. Like this system was set up, their parents knew it, the community knew it, and they kind of guided them to fit into the box. So even if they were born a round peg, they started to square off those sides a little bit and put them in there. And the kids that didn't have that, kids who were living in a studio apartment with 7 people or something like that, or living out of their car or something, they just didn't have that. And to get to them, that I agree with you, that has nothing to do with their potential. Like some of these kids could have been geniuses that could be working at Google someday, but it's just they needed some real structure about how to get from zero structure in their lives to some like way to some discipline and how to attack challenges and that are in front of them and things like that, because they just don't have examples of how to do that.
But I just to comment on this place makes Watts look like Disneyland. Like I think those are, because that's like those are microaggressions. Well, those are real aggressions, but that's like a whole like assumptions built in right there, right? And so you're making a ton of assumptions with that statement, not you, but your principal, right? And then also we often, because we do have to address poverty, because when we also talk about kids who are they're homeless, their parents are working 2 or 3 jobs, or maybe they're on disability, or have drug addiction, or whatever it could be that was the situation for that family. We fail to, number one, recognize that no matter what a family situation is, there's love, and there's a desire for those kids to do whatever better, right? All parents want better for their children. Now, some aren't equipped, they don't have the skills and tools, or if they just frankly don't have the time. Just the other day, I heard a single mom was telling me about how she'd spent the entire morning at Catholic services because she is trying to get a place for her and her daughter. And then they told her, well, you have to come back at 12:30. So then she came back at 12:30 and waited in line for 2 more hours. And then she was told, we don't have any more space today. You're going to have to come back in the morning. And this is a narrative that I heard when I taught in the Bronx, where families were spending the entire day ensuring that they had a place for their child to sleep that night. Because when you are homeless or when you are poor or living in poverty, it becomes a full-time job just to make sure that you can put food on the table for your children, if there even is a table. And so we do have to address poverty in order to be able to address many of these things that you're talking about. But one of those ways we can do that is to become more flexible, to, number one, recognize that every family has something valuable. And number two, when we're talking about families reading together, we're really talking about quality family time. We're not asking a parent to sit down and teach their child to read. We're asking a parent to sit down and spend 10 uninterrupted minutes of quality time with their child. Because really what we're talking about here is not skills, it's confidence and belief in oneself. And so if we restructured schools around this idea that every kid comes with something beautiful and that we need to find that and grow it. And then we thought about, okay, we're not teaching A, B, and C. We're teaching a kid how to decode. We're teaching a kid how to learn that. Because if you think about how the world works, I have a degree in filmmaking and another degree in communications, but I'm a teacher.
Right.
We don't often follow a linear path, right? And really it's about, can you enter a new environment and learn what you need to learn in order to be able to be skilled in that environment? And so that's where we need to go.
So, which takes us, I guess, a good place to kind of wrap it up is, wow, that went fast. Is the system. And, it's interesting because I think that as a whole, I mean, generally school unions and stuff like that, teachers unions, are, vote Democrat. And I think there's just general, psychological temperament would lean, most school teachers would probably be more on that side of the political aisle. But the system of tenure and unions and like stuck in their ways is actually a very conservative idea. Like, it's very interesting. I mean, charter schools and independent schools, I think I just read something that LA unions were investing millions of dollars to shut down charters and things like that. And I taught at 2 charters in LA, and I know that they have their issues and some of them are terrible, but some of them are great. And it's a little like lab to see what works and what doesn't. I mean, how are we supposed to do all these things that you're talking about unless we try it out? And so is this an issue with money? I was at a Bill and Melinda Gates school that had a ton of money. We had some really cool stuff, but it's not just money from my experience. It's not just a money issue. Money is needed, but that's not getting to the root. That's just like, oh, here you go. Homeless person on the street. Here's $10. Okay, I did my part. It's like, that's not helping. So what do you suggest for like how to do this? This seems like it's very solidified, but I mean, as far as teachers go, you've got to be one of the more powerful people. You have a platform. What would you advise, other teachers listening to try and do to try and make some waves?
Well, I think one of the things that we often miss in the charter school debate is that it shouldn't be an either or argument. And I don't honestly think that we need charter schools. What we need is flexibility within our public school system to be able to do the innovations that charter schools are able to do. Because that's always the argument, right? That, well, I want my kids to go to this charter school because they do this really amazing, innovative thing. And you're like, and I don't want the traditional model. Well, who says that the public school has to be a traditional model? We had an amazing project-based learning class in my school. My program alone, the Newcomer Center, they're very innovative programs that are very outside the traditional model of what a school looks like. And I think that the main argument about public versus charter is the money issue, because it is quite expensive to run a school system, and there aren't checks and balances on charter schools. So there's just too many charter schools that have, they take all the kids and then take all the money and then slowly weed out the kids that are too difficult, so to speak, but then keep the money. And that's like the nugget of like why people have such problem with charter schools. But we miss the whole point of the argument. When we're trying to argue that everybody should have the option between a public school and a charter school, we're trying to say that charters can do something that public schools can't, and public schools are the availability in the community, in the neighborhood, right? Mm. And that shouldn't even be the argument. The argument should be, how can we make a school where everybody in the community has access to that school so they don't have to travel? Because that's another equity issue, because if there's no access, there's no equity. So how can we ensure that there's a school within every neighborhood that can innovate, can be flexible, and can meet the needs of that local community and celebrate what they have and meet the needs of that community in the way that's best for that community? Because that's like, right, that's the beauty of the charter model, is that you can innovate. Well, why are we saying that, okay, that's okay there, but it's not okay in the public schools? That's the argument. That's the question. And we need to be getting to the bottom of that. What are we really saying when we're saying that this private school, this charter school, this choice school can have the flexibility to meet the needs of the students, but this other group can't? That's that right there. That is contributing to the systems that I'm talking about. And when we talk about white supremacy, we don't talk about like just a basic race question. We talk about how is this system that is only geared towards one element of our society, how is that going to benefit any of us? Because it doesn't. At the end of the day, when we're not honoring and celebrating and recognizing the talents and the potential of every community member and really working towards that, we're hurting all of us. Because how many brilliant minds are we missing out on?
Right. There's untapped genius everywhere. You know, in LA, Los Angeles is very segregated, more by not by race as much as by wealth. So you go to some of these very progressive private schools and stuff, and they're doing really cool, innovative things. And they have a mixed population racially, but it's all rich kids. They might have a couple of kids there on scholarship, but yeah, they're able to do, I teach at a private school now, and we just freedom. My class, my principal was like, hey, you get to teach a class next year, do whatever you want, basically. I was like, what? So I'm doing a civics class and I get to design it's incredible. I got to do that a little bit at charters. I stayed away from public schools, mainstream public schools, because of that reason. I wonder, is like, because unions have a lot of trouble. I don't want to like put the blame on somebody. I think it can. I think I agree with you. I think public schools can do it. I just think it's easier to steer a small ship or a small boat than it is a big ship. And there's a lot of people who are set in their ways. They don't want to do things differently. And I think that's a big problem. But I agree with you. I think we should look to like, why do we have to only do it in charter schools? It can be public schools. It's just hard to steer such a big ship. It really is.
Yeah, but the only way to have equity is to make sure that every kid has access. And so we have to figure it out. Like, that's not, I hesitate to use this phrase, but it's just not fair. It's just not fair. Like, we're putting barricades and barriers up for kids who are living in poverty. And unfortunately, that means disproportionately our communities of color, our Black kids, our brown kids, our indigenous communities. I mean, we didn't even talk about that. And that, I mean, the inequities involved in indigenous communities, our Native communities, is just incredible. And so that we really have to think about that, because we should be able to be innovative everywhere. And we should be able to, you know, my heart's desire, whatever I want to do in my classroom, because I know my kids. I know those kids. I value those kids. And I can see their strengths and their assets. And so I should be able to get them to where they need to go in whatever way I determine is the best way. And unfortunately, we have teachers out there who don't see the value in all kids, and we need to figure out what to do about that, because we really need to see the value in all kids, and we need to have a system that does that as well, because right now the system is completely deficit.
Yeah, once you've taught in diverse schools, I think very quickly you start to realize like, oh, this kid's a genius. It doesn't matter what his background is. I taught kids who were, you know, very, very tough situations. And I was like, wow, like he can figure this out. He can figure that out. Like, you know, or she can, you know, make something that no one else can make, or solve a puzzle or whatever it might be. I mean, I just think we're all in our own little like echo chambers and our own little bubbles. And we know about what we know about this population, we read, or we talk to someone, or we watch in the news, as opposed to immersing yourself in the population that you're trying to help. And that's a really important thing. You know, like going to school early, talking to the families, going to, you know, quinceañeras and things like that is like really important. So you get to know these people. And, you know, that's an issue that I have sometimes with people who are more progressive, is it's like, I'm going to help you, but I don't really know you, but I'm going to help you. I have a friend who's African-American who was from Indiana, moved to Sherman Oaks in LA, pretty like liberal area. And he's like, the racism here is different. In Indiana, it's like, hey, N-word. And then here it's like, I know what's best for you. You don't need to tell me. And he's like, well, can I tell you what I think is best for me or my community? They're like, no, I got it. It's a very like like patronizing under the guise of empathy, but very patronizing thing of like, I'm going to take care of you. Right. And that's not what I don't think either of you or I are advocating for. It's really understanding what these communities need, knowing them well.
Yes. Yeah. And seeing value, like humans.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there is a ton, and it's terribly sad how many, of these kids are raised in these terrible situations, surrounded by violence, surrounded by, horrible households and things like that. I know you got to go. But, I do want to revisit on a future podcast at some point, the system as being like, race versus class and things like that. I think it was really important that we got into it though. So I appreciate you kind of steering in that direction. I want to get this going, Mandy. Like, I think that we can form some sort of, coalition of teachers. I don't know if it's through the interwebs, using internet or whatever, but the idea that we should help every kid in America to excel, to become an entrepreneur, to become some sort of, in the medical industry, that there is untapped potential, and it is foolish for us in education to not go after those kids because it's a little bit more challenging, or because they don't, we have to change a little bit of the way the obstacle course is set up. But it would be foolish of us to not find a way to get personalized education. And I think we can now. So many things are personalized. Netflix, you only watch what you want to watch. There's so many things in people's lives that are now like streamlined. You get the clothes. You don't have to just get the clothes at the store in town. You can order them from anywhere online. Everything's personalized. Maybe we can find some sort of personalized education. I don't know what that looks like, because you could do it online, but I mean, I'm sure as you do, like, the best connections, the most impact I've ever had in education was sitting down with a kid, looking them in their eyes and talking to them. And that's hard to do online. But there's something here.
Yeah. I've taught online, and it is not ideal by any stretch of the imagination. And actually, I visited Khan Academy. Yeah. With Sal Khan, and they even said they tried to do a full online, and they found that they were unsuccessful without an actual teacher.
Yeah.
So they changed their model.
But is this an unsolvable problem, or do we just have to think harder? We have to think our way through this, right?
We have to think harder, and we have to get our egos out of it. Yeah. Because that's part of the problem, is that we have just like going back to the very beginning of our conversation about all of these organizations with their hands in it, and everybody's ego is tied to it, and everybody. But you know what? I'm not the important piece here. The kids are the important piece, because I'm 43 and I'm headed, I'm not quite there, but I'm going to go over the hill here soon. And like, the kids are everything, and we need to value them, and we need to help them believe in themselves and have confidence and know how to be a learner. Because it's like that whole teach a man to fish thing. Mm-hmm. Like, where are all of us if we're not all supported and safe and getting what we need? Like, come on.
I agree with you. And I appreciate you coming on, doing this podcast, Mandy. This is important stuff. And for educators out there, like, yes, it's going to be a challenge, but let's brainstorm this. I mean, this cylinder, like, let's talk about this. There's going to be holes in all of these. If I come up with a plan, hey, I got a great plan, let's do this. And then I hope someone's like, nope, that's not going to work for this reason. Oh, okay. Well, but it might work for these reasons. Good. And we can streamline something, get going. Let's just not be indifferent. I get that there's certain elements of being a teacher that it's not, maybe this is wrong to say, but there are elements that are kind of cush. Like, if you have tenure, you have a union, you get summers off. I'm not saying it's an easy job. Okay. I've been doing it for 13 years. I know, but we can get away with not doing extra work. But maybe this is something important. Maybe this is something that's really important. If you look at the way the country's going, you look at we're very comfortable in a lot of ways. Even being poor in America is probably better now than it was 20 years ago. But when you look at things like depression and suicide and heroin overdoses and now all these mass shootings, there is a real crisis of meaning, and kids grow up to not have a purpose in life. And a lot of things in this system has failed them in a real way. And then you look at gang violence, and that's on the uptick, and like all this stuff. It's
and the suicide rates amongst our LGBTQI kids.
mm-hmm.
But it's all because that box. Kids don't fit in a box. And when we're talking about white supremacy, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a box.
Yeah, and let's treat people as individuals. So what does widespread personal education look like? I mean, like we got it. We can figure it out. We can use better. This isn't a zero-sum game. We can make better use of the resources that we have. Okay, the same way that we can now get, clean water to everybody if we need to, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. It's not zero sum. It's not like my time for this kid is taken away from this kid. We can find a way to get every kid what they need. And it's just going to take some discussion and some talking. I hope that this is maybe, something that can spark that.
Yeah, me too. And I'm happy to, I know we didn't get into all the topics that you wanted to.
Cool. No, it's fine.
I'm happy to come back again. So.
Fine. I would love to have you back again, Mandy. Yeah. Is there anything, where can people find you? Anything to whatever plug? Do you have a movie coming out? No, but anything about where people can find you and pick your brain or see what you're all about and things like that?
I'm on Twitter at Mandy Ray Writes, and that's MandyRHEA Writes, like WRITES. You can find me on Facebook, of course, and Instagram. And then that Mandy Manning. And then I have a blog. It's called Teaching Fearless, and it's mandymanning.com. I haven't written anything in it in a little while because I've been a little bit busy, but I plan on this year picking back up with that. So you can follow what I'm doing there. But I'm very passionate about all of this. And I do believe that we can make change if we just believed that with flexibility, it actually makes our life better and easier. That would be, let's continue this conversation.
Let's do it. All right. Mandy Manning, thank you so much for doing it. And thank you all for listening.